right, let's talk about oscillators. Basically, whenever you're probably thinking about any kind of synthesis, the oscillator is one of the first things that you want to look at, and the oscillator. So one thing I want to address real quick is whenever you're dealing with sample-based synthesizers, that basically when you get done watching this and we get done talking about oscillators, that you kind of try to go back and see that sample that you put into that sampler as the oscillator. Because basically that's what's producing the initial sound, just like the oscillator is in a normal synthesizer. So when you see a sample-based synthesizer, that sample is basically acting the same, is doing the same thing that the oscillator would be doing in a normal synthesizer as a starting point. So, I wanted to address that real quick. The other thing, when you're dealing with an oscillator, that basically what are you dealing with? You're basically, if you look on Wikipedia, it says, is an electronic circuit that produces a periodic oscillating electronic signal, a wave. Does that make sense? And we've already talked about what a periodic wave is. So that's the basic concept. So it's either in a hardware or a software environment. So if it's in a hardware environment, it's a circuit, an actual circuit, that's producing either a sinusoid or some type of basic waveform for like what we talked about, wavetable synthesis. And, that's just the basic concept of it. So if you're hitting like the middle C on the keyboard, that frequency that's representative of the fundamental tone in that, in that timbre, that frequency, that sinusoid is what will be produced from the oscillator. Or it'll produce one of those basic waveforms from that fundamental frequency. And that's a real simple way to look at it. The other thing is, I don't how pertinent that's going to be to you, but if you go back and watch some of those videos that I made on electronics and audio engineering and things like that, it's not direct current. It's been, transformed into alternating current so that, it can go, have a positive, a zero, and a negative value as it goes through its cycle. So if you watch those videos on sound and timbres and things like that, that you probably got a pretty good understanding of that anyway. So that's just basically what it does. So, I'm trying to keep it real simple so that it's not complex. So when you think about the oscillator, that's its basic function. And there can be lots of oscillators on the synthesizer, and different oscillators can do different things. So, I hope I kept that real simple so that you can look into it, and there's a lot of complexities about what an oscillator is and what it'll do. But, that it just provides a basic building block, a basic sound, either a sinusoid or, some kind of basic waveform that we've talked about. It might be a square wave or a sawtooth wave or a triangle wave. And most of the time, it's just basic waveforms to start working on and start to try to sculpt and do additive, do all the different types of synthesis we've talked about to those basic waveforms. So let's take a little look at the synthesizer. All right, so the first thing that it could be doing is creating some basic wavetable waves that we've talked about. So it's going to produce either a sinusoid, or it's going to produce some type of sawtooth wave, triangle wave, square wave, or some other wave that's an actual set parameter, that it's going to be that set wave that it creates. Or it's going to have an arbitrary waveform generator, something like this, to where, here is a ramp wave with its harmonics, a square tooth wave with harmonics, and if it's just got the sinusoid, then you're starting out with just a basic frequency, and you start adjusting this here, that it starts adding harmonic content. And then that wave will end up being just like one of these that'll just be repeated and repeated and repeated, like in wavetable synthesis. Now that's the first thing that it's going to do. The next thing it can be doing is some basic parameters of tuning and panning and level. So you're talking about semitones, it's tuning that frequency that you're starting out with, like on middle C, up semitones, a half steps, in forms of half steps, or in cents, meaning 100 cents equals a half step. So those kind of fine tunings of whatever frequency you're starting with, the level, the volume level of it, the decibel level that it's being played at, and panning of it, whether it's right or left or somewhere in the middle. And those are some of the very basic parameters that would be on the oscillator. All right, some of the other things that we've talked about different type of synthesis it might be doing also. On this one, it's doing volume modulation by connecting this to a low frequency oscillator that we'll get to. It might be doing phase modulation by connecting this to a low frequency oscillator. It might be adjusting the phase of the sinusoid or the waveform. Phase distortion by either adjusting it with some parameter or actually hooking it up to the knob up to a low frequency oscillator, and things like that. So, and here's the volume, because up here, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. This is the frequency modulation to connect this to a low frequency oscillator. And this is the volume modulation to hook that up to a low frequency oscillator. So some of those concepts that we were talking about are going to sometimes be on that oscillator like that. And the biggest thing to get through your head is each one of them, each one of these, this is going to deal with the frequency modulation by hooking this up to a low frequency oscillator that we'll get to, or it might be having some other parameters that it's being set up with that, how that it's doing that. Does that make sense? And what exactly? So each one of those parameters those basic things that we've talked about, that, the biggest thing to keep in mind is go look at the instructions to find out how exactly it's doing it and how clear of an action it is. That's very important, so that, you can understand how clear the function is or how fuzzy it is, so that you can understand what you're dealing with as far as those modifications dealing with that oscillator. All right, one other thing, when we had talked about this arbitrary waveform generator here, sometimes when you get into some synths, some of those things won't be addressed like that, like changing the actual waveform. There'll be some knob. So, hooking up to an oscilloscope or having an oscilloscope on there to see what it's doing is very pertinent. So I just wanted to address that. The last thing is I kind of want to talk about nondescript functions, that can be on the oscillator. On this one, it has this thing that says octave. Now, you have to read on this to see exactly what octave range that it's dealing with, how it's going to add, it's becoming additive synthesis, and it's adding something to it. This button here is random phase. We understand phase, so you're going to have to read and see exactly what that's doing, as far as the oscillation, how it's affecting whatever waveform is coming through there. Things like this, sub, this is going to add a lower level frequency to the primary frequency that you're dealing with to add sub-level content to whatever you're working with. And this one, spread, this thing, they say that it starts adding more oscillators and then spreading them out so that it starts sounding more full. And if you go look at those videos I did on spatialization, I think it's trying to address that from that kind of perspective. And, also on here's one that's called fractalization. Now, you'd have to read about this, but basically what it's trying to do is it's very much warping the wave that's coming out of the oscillator. And you might be putting together square waves and sawtooth waves and breaking them up in some way that's producing some strange wave that may not be really clear and descriptive about what it's doing, and take some fussing around to really understand what it's actually doing to that waveform, that you're going to start sculpting on. So, the basic thing to understand there is if the oscillators are dealing some of the basic things we talked about synthesis, like we've talked about here, that, it's dealing with those basic functions in some way, and you need to read more in depth about how that synthesizer might be trying to apply those concepts with this knob, and its connections to it, or its parameters, or some, what's adjusting the actual parameter and what it's, how it's relating to that. And that's a real basic concept that just takes some investigation. And then other things that can be, very vague, things like this. And there can be lots of things like this fractalize. I mean, sometimes you'll get synthesizers doing all kinds of weird stuff that, they're trying to break up the waveform or do things that are, random, or all kinds of things. Because a lot of times when you're dealing with You know, you're dealing with quasi-periodic waveforms, you know, that some of those things can be random. So randomization can be a very huge tool for building natural sounding sounds. So you kind of got to look at it that way, and that's basically the purpose of anything that's random. Random can be good if it's, you know, controllable. Does that make sense? And anything that you see in here that's not directly relating the type of synthesis that we've been talking about or we talked about, that it's something else, or it's addressing those issues in some other way that you really need to look into and find out, and with clarity, what it's doing to make a certain decision whether it's a very precise and clear tool on your oscillator or on your oscillator module, or if it's something very vague, you know, and fuzzy. And it might add some kind of things to, you know, the waveform or the sinusoid, that, you know, when you're starting out creating your sound, that it's kind of vague or it's very clear, and working with it, you know, with that understanding. Does that make sense? And sometimes they can be very descriptive, and with a little bit of reading, that there's some really cool things, and sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's really random or really vague about what it's doing. And, you know, sometimes it's very controllable, and sometimes it's not controllable at all. And, you know, you just kind of have to approach it that way. So whenever you're dealing with this module that's the oscillator, that's basically what you're looking at. And the things we talked about are the basics that you need to keep in mind. I have no doubt that if you dig around enough, you will find oscillators that are doing some other type of thing. There is no doubt about that. But, you know, normally those are the basics. So I hope we covered that very well, so that when you see the oscillator, that you have some kind of understanding of what it's trying to do or what it can do, and so that you can approach it one step at a time and one parameter at a time to really focus on what exactly this module is trying to accomplish, and, you know, and understand it clearly, with clarity, what exactly is happening there. And I hope I laid that out, didn't make it too complicated and too complex, but address some of the complexities well enough to where that you won't look at it like it's like, oh my God, what is that thing doing? You know, so that you can approach it with a little bit more clarity in your mind of what you're looking for, so that you can start to figure out exactly how that oscillator module is approaching the concepts that we've talked about. So I hope that was fairly well, and we described that pretty well. And next we're going to look at LFO oscillators, low frequency oscillators, and address those. So peace, hope, love. See you in the next video.